What would one of the greatest Taoist sages say about our modern world? Let's find out. One of the aspects of Taoism that a lot of people don't appreciate is that it is a critique of society. And it came about during the Warring States period of China. So it was a critique of Confucianism itself. And one of the greatest philosophers of that time was Zhuangzi. Now, Zhuangzi was a philosopher during the Warring States period of China, and I would say probably the most important Taoist philosopher to learn after Lao Tzu. And I would say actually that the Zhuangzi is a more important text than the Tao Te Ching in understanding the essence of Taoist thought, because the Zhuangzi text is the end of Taoist thought. And if you want to understand Taoism to its nth degree, you need to study the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. A lot of people neglect the Zhuangzi, but it is likely more important. And when we talk about Zhuangzi, he is one of the most humorous and clever philosophers you'll ever come across. And that's why his ability to critique a society, its sicknesses, its hypocrisy, he is number one, because he can reflect on the way the world is, but he can always reorient our awareness back to the oneness of life in looking at this. So he's using the world as a tool so that we could understand the true nature of oneness. So he's not saying that we need to accept all of the BS in the world. He's saying that we need to keep a keen eye on the hypocrisy of the world, because that allows us to guide our life in a way that is oriented towards the oneness of the Tao. But he's also saying don't shy away from the world. He was a big believer in being in the world but not of it. And so his philosophy in some sense was meant for the spiritual elite, which I will explain in this verse from the Zhuangzi. And so who the spiritual elite are, you will understand in a minute, but that's why the Zhuangzi text is for those who have come very, very far on the path. And I've mentioned in previous videos before that reading the Zhuangzi and understanding it is one of the most important books to understand a lot of other Eastern traditions: Advaita Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Yoga, Sankhya, and Taoism itself. If you understand the Zhuangzi, then you'll understand all of those at a deeper level. He is that profound in his way of thinking and his way of explaining life. And so I'm going to read you an important verse from the introduction actually of the Zhuangzi text by Burton Watson. This is a translation by Burton Watson, and I highly recommend anything translated by Burton Watson, no matter whether it's Cold Mountain or any text that he's done. He had an amazing ability to translate and understand the heart of the text, and none more so than the Zhuangzi. And so let me read to you this important verse by Burton Watson about Zhuangzi himself. At this time, the philosophy of Zhuangzi came to be studied and appreciated to a degree unknown before. Its unconventionality and skepticism appealed to an age of disorder in which conventional moral standards seem to have lost all validity. Its implications of a spiritual elite who could transcend the bonds of the world and wander in the realm beyond life and death, whether such release was interpreted metaphorically or literally, appealed to a society dominated by aristocratic tastes. It was an age of ferment, of widening intellectual horizons, in many ways like that of Zhuangzi himself, and one in which Zhuangzi's mystic vision of freedom seemed to make better sense than it ever had during the staid and stable years of the Han Empire. It was also to note its grimmer side, an age of political peril and violent reversals of fortune, and Zhuangzi's assurances that death is as much to be desired as life must have brought comfort to the numerous officials and intellectual leaders of the time who, victims of some sudden shift of power, were obliged to face the executioner's axe. Now, the time that Burton Watson is referring to is the Warring States period and after the Warring States period, when the spread of Buddhism into China. And so he's speaking about the amoral aspect of Taoism, which a lot of people don't understand because people are so caught up in their own version of morality. And Taoism pulls that all apart because you can't have a subjective perspective of morality. That only works according to wherever you live and according to the religion and the society and the culture that you follow. And that's what Zhuangzi are allowed to pull apart, because we are natural, and naturalness itself is the true morality. It's not bound by rules and regulations. And so what Burton Watson is talking about in the introduction is that Zhuangzi offers some sort of spiritual oxygen to the world to get outside of moral conventional standards that we set often, right? So we set all of these moral standards and we go by a conventional way of thinking. And Zhuangzi pulls the rug from underneath all of that and says, wait up, we are nature itself. Why don't we follow what is natural instead of what we create through our mind? And so even in Zhuangzi's time, the moral standards and the conventional way of thinking lost all its validity because of the damage that it was producing, right? And he often targets Confucianism, the damage that Confucianism had done to the society at the time. And so he was sitting back as a Taoist, observing the way people's natures were being warped according to that. And so if he saw the modern world, he would see the same warping of people's nature, but to a much higher degree. And so as Burton Watson said, this type of philosophy appeals to the spiritual elite, those who can understand that there is this disorder in the world and there is this warping of people's nature. And so it's up to us to return to the uncarved block, to use Lao Tzu's terminology, the raw basis material that we actually are, that we were from birth. It's about returning to that, maybe a little bit different, but returning to that. And so that's who Zhuangzi appeals to, the spiritual elite, the ones who can see through the veil of the illusion around us. And so that spiritual elite, as Burton Watson said, wander in the realm beyond life and death. And so they are not bound by moral standards, by conventional ways of thinking, because they have gone beyond the illusion of this and that, the illusion of cutting the world up according to our conditioning, according to our projections, the measurement of Maya, the illusion of measurement, which eclipses the actuality of the Tao, the oneness of the Tao. And Zhuangzi is famous for saying, when there is no more this and that, one can see the infinite in all things because one resides in the still point of the Tao. And so that is the goal for all of us on the spiritual path. But we have to realize the illusion around us and how it tries to pull us into a certain type of thinking by warping and shaping our nature. Because once your nature and that is shaped, then you'll never be what you originally were, unless you realize that. And that's why in Zen Buddhism they say, do you remember your original face before your birth? And so that's part of the goal in Taoism as well, and in all of the Eastern spiritual traditions. And so Zhuangzi had this mystic vision of freedom, right? The freedom from our projections, the freedom from Maya, where we can see the world without our conditioning, where we can see the world without labels and interpreting it a certain way to appease our own way of thinking. His freedom is freedom from all of those projections and just to see the world as it is, as the Tao, as Brahman, if you will, to use Sanskrit. And so Zhuangzi's way of thinking is completely politically incorrect. That's what you need to remember. Taoism itself is politically incorrect. Actually, most of the Eastern spiritual traditions are politically incorrect. They don't subscribe to whatever the politically correct narrative is. And that is always changing. And Zhuangzi would just continually make fun of that in the modern day. Even as Burton Watson says in this chapter about how people have to face the executioner's axe because they step out of line with the moral standards, Zhuangzi would make complete fun of that. And he does make fun of that. And we often see in the modern day where people are eager to cancel someone because they said something that hurt their feelings and so forth and so on. And Zhuangzi would just sit back and laugh because it's the projection, it's the conditioning you have which is triggered and reacting to it. And that's the warping of your nature, right? You have been warped by whatever is politically correct, in air quotes, and you are trying to please others to follow your way of thinking, which is not your way of thinking. You've borrowed that from the companies that promote that, maybe the social media platforms that you are on, and they promote that, and then that infiltrates your way of thinking, and that is not the clean slate of the mind. That is a conditioned mentality. And then your mind, if you are conditioned, can sometimes try and justify your way of thinking, of being politically correct. And Zhuangzi would again sit back and laugh. And so funnily enough, in relation to what I'm saying, Burton Watson actually says in this that Zhuangzi would actually have a calming effect on those who are going to be cancelled, because he assures them that death is as positive as life itself. Burton Watson says in here, for those who have to face the executioner's axe, right? And so one thing about Zhuangzi is that he doesn't have a fear of death. As Burton Watson says in this quote, that fear should be desired as much as life. Now that's an ironic statement, because we usually feel that life itself is something that we need to hold on to and be afraid of losing and do whatever we can to live as long as we can. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's the fear that's driving that. And so Zhuangzi is saying, how do you know death is such a bad thing? We only see people sick and dying, but how do you know death itself is a bad thing? And so he is indifferent to death. He thinks that death is just a transformation of life and something that we should actually lean into and something that we should enjoy instead of trying to avoid and be fearful of. He said that life and death itself and birth are all the same transformational process, but we think about just this one aspect of it in a fearful way, which is death, right? We think of it in a fearful way. And so Zhuangzi is saying we don't need to think about it in that way at all. And so that is classical Zhuangzi, right? Unconventional, skeptical, questioning without having a motive, but just questioning the common assumptions people have about life and death and about the way the world is. Zhuangzi is like the ultimate skeptic, but not in a way that's negative, but he's skeptical in the sense that he's trying to show people's ingrained assumptions that often were taught or inculcated from the society and culture that they have, and he's trying to get you to think outside of that conventional way of thinking. And so that's why it's one of the most important texts to ever read, because it questions your own assumptions. It gets you out of a conventional way of thinking, and it also exposes your biased morality. And that's one of the most important aspects of the Zhuangzi, because most people have a biased morality and everyone's morality tends to be different. But we often don't base our morality just on the way nature is. And Zhuangzi is trying to get us back into that state of naturalness, Zitran, that fundamental naturalness that is there. You don't need to tell your heart to beat, for example. You don't need to tell the stars in the sky to move a certain way according to where we are. It all happens to us. And that's actually how our life is, right? That's what Wu-Wei is. That's effortless living and the path of non-interference, where life is just happening and you're not trying to control any aspect of it. And so that's why he's very important. And as Burton Watson said, usually his teachings are for, in air quotes, the spiritual elite, but in my opinion, they're for everybody. Now, maybe you are the spiritual elite because you can understand the teachings. Now, I read the Zhuangzi when I was younger, and a lot of it didn't make any sense. But then as I studied more and as I developed my way of thinking and understanding, particularly with Eastern spirituality and philosophy, I can start to understand the deeper layers of the Zhuangzi. And there's many deeper layers still to understand within this text. It's not that one comes to the end of a text like this. It's something to contemplate on for a lifetime. And so Zhuangzi himself is probably the number one philosopher for people to understand the current world, because he'll give you a different way of thinking about things. He will get you outside of morality. He will get you outside of political correctness. He will get you outside of conventional thinking so that you can see the world in its truest context, in its truest nature, and then you can understand the oneness of the Tao that is constantly trying to revert our attention back to. But a lot of us are so involved in the world that we have forgotten the oneness of Tao. And that is the importance of Zhuangzi, and that is why one must read the Zhuangzi text. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.